Hey, we wanted to let you know about our latest upcoming webinar on April 26th. We will be taking a deep dive into what Bill W. from AA called the, quote, final frontier of recovery. What is that? Emotional sobriety. Are you in recovery and ready to move beyond stage one recovery, which is sexual sobriety, and embrace stage two recovery, which is emotional sobriety and emotional well-being? This is the webinar for you. Or are you a betrayed partner who wants to develop emotional resilience and self-regulation in the midst of your grieving and trauma? Then this webinar will help. At the time of this recording, we have a few spots open, so go to joy-recovery.com and click on webinars to secure your reservation today. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Joy Recovery Radio. Glad that you've joined us today. What we want to talk about today is relapse. And specifically, we're going to talk about what is the difference between a relapse or a slip. And then we're going to get into a certain tool that I use with my clients to help prevent a relapse and to recognize threats in our recovery. And I want to talk to you about a 3-step process that you need to follow when there is a relapse. First, we want to look at what is the difference between a relapse and a slip. What do we mean by this? And the short answer from my own perspective is there is no distinction. There is no difference. A slip is just a way of minimizing a relapse, usually. And I will say that most betrayed partners see it the same way, that we just need to lose the term slip from our vocabulary and take ownership for any relapse that we've done. Usually when someone is referring to a slip, it's for one of two reasons. Number one, they are rationalizing and minimizing their behavior and what they've done. Or number two, they haven't clearly defined what their bottom line behaviors are. What constitutes a relapse? What are specific acting out behaviors? And if you haven't clearly defined that, and I encourage you to define that with your partner, what is an acting out behavior? What is a relapse? When you clearly define that, there's really no need for the term slip. Some people will use the term slip because they hear it in recovery meetings and recovery circles, and they've adopted that language because other addicts are minimizing and rationalizing what they've done. I think it's helpful just to lose that term altogether. But when it comes to relapse, there's a specific tool that I want to talk about that I share with my clients to help prevent a relapse. I call it a threat detection tool. It's to understand the threats that are inside of me and around me that could lead to acting out behaviors and being very mindful of those threats. And then I want to talk about a 3-step process to follow. So if you have had a relapse event, you learn from it and you practice these 3 things to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So first, let's talk about the threat detection tool. So for those of you who are watching this video, you'll be able to see the graphic. For those of you who are listening on Apple Podcast, I will share in the show notes a link to the graphic, but I'll describe it as you're listening. So if you'll imagine 3 concentric circles. Now, this is not the 3 circles that some people use in sex addiction recovery, but this is more of a threat detection tool. And if there's a relapse, you can use the same tool as a relapse review or a relapse map. It's a way of taking a post-mortem, reverse engineer this relapse event and to see, where did I relax? Where did a threat come in and I didn't take action? How can I strengthen and solidify my recovery so that this doesn't happen again? So picture 3 circles: inner circle, middle circle, outer circle. The inner circle are the bottom line behaviors. This is how you define what is a relapse in particular. So for many, it's going to include either porn or masturbation, going to prostitutes, perhaps emotional affairs or physical affairs, hookups or hookup apps, massage parlors, cross-dressing, whatever your bottom line behaviors were. Now, there's one thing that I encourage men to include in their inner circle that defines relapse. And there's some debate and there is some resistance to this. And I understand that, but I have my reasons for why I encourage men to include lust and objectification as part of that definition of relapse. That if you engage in lust, if you engage in objectification, that is a form of acting out. Some would call that a slip. Some would call that middle circle. I think that's a mistake. I think that's setting you up for going even further into acting out. But a couple of reasons why I include lust and objectification when it comes to defining for me what a relapse is. First of all, it's because it's the area that Jesus focused on. He said it's not enough to just focus on adultery or what you do with your body. It begins in the heart. And it's the same thing to him. And for most betrayed partners, it's the same thing to them as well. That if you are having sex with someone internally in your heart and in your mind, it's a form of betrayal. It is infidelity. It is unfaithful, and it is hurtful. And so they see it the same way that Jesus sees it, and it makes sense. The second reason that many men are reluctant to put it as part of their definition of a relapse is because they feel like they can't stop. They don't have a sense of personal agency. And so because they feel like they're setting themselves up for failure, they want to give themselves a loophole that lust is something that's going to take years to drain that swamp, and I'll eventually eradicate it from my life, but I don't want to make it part of my definition of relapse to begin with because I don't feel a sense of personal agency. I don't feel like I have what it takes to overcome it right now. That's something I'll get to later. I'll just focus on these other acting out behaviors, but lust and objectification, I'll just call that a slip. I'll call that middle circle. That's something that we'll eventually get to. And that's coming from a place of lacking personal agency. When I hear that, I think of the quote from Henry Ford, where he said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. If you think that you can't stop lusting, you're right. If you think that you can stop lusting, you're right. I remember when I first entered into what I would call real recovery and true repentance and renewing my mind, I knew that I had to stop all forms of lust and objectification or I was going to lose my partner. What I did not know was how I was going to do that. And I did not have a sense of personal agency. For like the first 4 to 6 weeks of true recovery, I did not feel like I was going to be able to do this. And so my strategy was, I'm just going to stay at home and I'm not going to look at any screens and I'm never going to leave the house. And this is just going to be my life. And it's coming from a place of fear and terror and panic and no agency whatsoever. And I remember the very first time I ventured to a grocery store, I was absolutely petrified. I was afraid that I was going to, air quote, accidentally lust after someone. And that came from decades of believing that lust is inevitable, that all men lust, that lust is ubiquitous, that it's impossible not to lust. All these false beliefs that were actually, I'm sad to report, reinforced by many of the recovery meetings that I was going to. When I would share with the men in my 12-step meetings and in my check-in meetings and my recovery meetings that I'm wanting to eradicate lust, that I want to make this part of my relapse definition, they would say things like, that's impossible. God made us visual creatures. Every man lust. You're being too hard on yourself. They were actually encouraging me to put it in the middle circle or to not make it part of my relapse prevention plan. And this was, in my opinion, and in the opinion of my partner, horrible guidance and a horrible example. It became normalized in these meetings for men to talk about quote unquote slips where they had lust or objectified or sexualized a woman, looked too long, surpassed the quote unquote 3-second rule. But it was a slip and they're still sober and they still have a chip and they're 1 year sober, or 2 years sober, or 6 months sober, or whatever. And it was normalizing lust and objectification. And I did not need that kind of messaging, that kind of example, that kind of influence in my life. Also, there was a lack of personal ownership of taking responsibility for lust and objectification. They would blame the quote addict inside of them. Like there's this monster who lives inside of them that sometimes takes over and does things against their will and they don't have free will during those moments. These two ways of thinking were not helpful for me in my recovery. And so it's not that I wasn't doing recovery work. I was doing very strategic, focused, effective recovery work, but this was not helping me. Now, caveat, disclaimer, I don't judge any of my brothers that make that part of their plan. There's no judgment here whatsoever. I'm just saying for me, I did not want lust, objectification to be part of my quote unquote middle circle or outside of the definition of relapse, nor did I want to spend a lot of time with men that were normalizing that behavior, rationalizing that behavior, minimizing that behavior, and not taking ownership for that behavior by blaming some kind of disease. And so for me, it was helpful for me not to be a part of those environments. And yes, lust and objectification is a part of my inner circle that defines what is a relapse. For those of you who are still believing the myth that it's impossible not to lust, let me tell you that I can testify, and many of my brothers can testify, that you can go the rest of your life. You can go months, years, without lusting and objectifying after a woman. It does require intentionality, focus, consistency. It's a new way of living and it's a new way of relating. It's inviting our higher power to be a part of that process. But thanks to God's incredible design of our brain and neuroplasticity, we are able to create new neural pathways, new ways of thinking and operating and relating that replace over time with consistency and repetition our old ways of thinking. And so just like it used to be automatic that I used to lust or objectify a woman, now it's just as automatic that I bounce my eyes and I pray for that person and I focus on my higher power. So I don't buy into the myth that lust is something that we cannot overcome and it doesn't need to be a part of our relapse definition. I encourage men to make it part of your relapse definition and to make it part of your recovery plan to no longer engage in this, because I would call that false recovery if you're still engaging in it. So the very first part of the threat detection circles is that inner circle that defines what is a relapse. The circle that is surrounding that is what I call not acting out, that's the inner circle. Now the middle circle surrounding that is what I call acting in. Acting in is 12 different ways that we keep others, God, self, and others, especially our partners, if you're in a relationship, 12 specific ways that we keep them at a distance. We give them the stiff arm. This is intimacy avoidance or avoiding intimacy. That's what acting in is. Acting out is false intimacy. It's trying to meet legitimate needs in illegitimate ways. Acting in is avoiding intimacy. When we engage in acting in, we are setting ourselves up for acting out. So this is a threat. This is a risk factor. And we need to detect this because this is going to lead eventually to acting out behaviors. So let's look at just very briefly, what are those 12 ways of acting in, 12 ways of avoiding intimacy? The first is passivity. This is where we're not being proactive. We're not engaging in the needed and necessary conversations with our partners. This is where we're not taking risks, the risk of intimacy and vulnerability and transparency. And this is where we're avoiding responsibility. We keep our partners and God and ourselves at a distance. We avoid intimacy with our passivity. The second acting in behavior is stonewalling. And this is where we simply refuse to engage in a conversation, or we put a stop to it and we refuse to continue the conversation. Third would be withholding love or withholding care. Basically what it means is my partner is in need of some kind of care, some kind of expression of love, whatever their love language is. And I intentionally withhold that from them. It can be withholding touch. It can be withholding words of affirmation. It can be withholding acts of service. It's various ways that we withhold love from them, or we withhold care from them. Like they're struggling, they're crying, they're hurting, they're grieving, they're going through something, and we bypass them and we don't extend to them the care that they need. This is a form of keeping them at a distance. This is acting in. This is avoiding intimacy. A fourth one is manipulation. And this is where we try to convince them that something is flawed or wrong with the way they're thinking or the way they're feeling or what they're doing or their perception of reality. The fifth one is criticizing. And this is when we're overly critical, that we focus on faults and not attributes that we appreciate. We're focusing on resentments instead of gratitudes. Or we engage in what's called tit for tat, that we feel like they pointed out something about us, and so we remind them about something about them, that they make us feel less than in some way, so we make them feel less than in some way. Another tactic that we use of acting in or avoiding intimacy is shame. And I'm not talking about our own experience with shame. I'm talking about shaming others. This is where we embarrass them in some way, or we intentionally try to bring them down to our level. Another form is blaming. And this is where we don't take ownership, but instead there's someone else or something else that's at fault, that it's not our fault. I can't be blamed. And so we don't take ownership. Another form of acting in is hiding. And this is where I'm not going to show you who I really am. I'm not going to speak up. I'm not going to have a voice. I'm not going to tell you how I really feel. I'm going to hide parts of who I am from you. Another form of acting in is avoidance. And avoidance is slightly different from hiding. Hiding is intentionally covering up different parts of who I am, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, who I really am. But avoiding is staying clear of any unpleasant conversation or unpleasant reality. Or sometimes we avoid our partners with busyness. Sometimes work becomes our new mistress, and we spend our time there because then we don't have to deal with our partner. That's avoidance. Another form of acting in is aggression. And this is where we use our anger or we use intimidation. We use our aggression to try and control the conversation that's happening that we don't like or we feel it's out of control, or we just try to control the person with our aggression. Another form of intimacy avoidance is deception. And this is where we're telling half-truths, or we're covering up things, or we're trying to erase histories, or we're omitting details on purpose, or we're just sitting on secrets. All of these are forms of deception. And that is a way to give a stiff arm to our partners and keep them at a distance. And finally, just excuses. This is where we justify what we've done, or we rationalize what we've done, and we hide behind excuses. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are 12 of the primary ways that we men act in. When we are engaging in these behaviors, we are setting ourselves up for acting out. And so if you just had a recent relapse, it would be good to look at these 12 and see which ones were I engaging in. The reason these are so critical is because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite, the antidote for addiction, is intimacy. So if you're avoiding intimacy, you're not in true recovery, and you're setting yourself up to going back to your acting out behavior because it is on the opposite end of the spectrum of intimacy. In fact, many partners will feel like their addict is still acting out even when he's not, because he's acting in. And they still feel that same distance and that same lack of emotional intimacy and intellectual intimacy and transparency. But now it's not because they're acting out, it's because they're acting in. The impact on the partner is the same. And often, because the impact is the same, they assume the behavior is the same. And he must be still in his active addiction. He must still be acting out because he's doing all of these acting in behaviors. He's still avoiding an intimate connection with me. So what we're looking at in our threat detection tool is we're looking at what exactly is a relapse. How do we define that? These are our bottom line behaviors in the inner circle. And then, am I engaging in acting in some way? Because that is a warning sign. That is a threat that I'm on my way to acting out if I'm doing this. And then the third circle, the outer circle, is what we just call threats. So you've got acting out as the inner circle, acting in as the middle circle, and then the outer circle are threats. And these are also broken up into 12 categories. The very first one is psychological threats. And this can be if you have some kind of personality disorder, if you have any kind of mental health issue, if you have clinical depression, any kind of psychological disorder you've been diagnosed with, and you're skipping your medication or you're avoiding your appointments with your psychiatrist or your psychologist or your therapist, these are threats. These are psychological threats that could lead to a relapse or acting out behavior. Another category of threats is conversational. So this can look a few different ways. This could be you're at work and you're frustrated with your boss and you talk to a female colleague and she's also frustrated with the same boss, and you guys feel this understanding, this connection over that gosh, she understands me, she gets it. And there can be this bond that forms from that. That is a threat. Or if you have someone who begins to confide in you about personal things, or you begin to confide in them about personal things, or you engage in flirtation, or they engage in flirtation and you don't shut it down. Or if in some way they come across as needing something, something's broken, they're upset, and you feel this instinct in you to be their hero and to rescue them, to be that knight in shining armor for them. Through that conversation and that dynamic, that is a threat that you need to be aware of. So it's psychological, conversational. Third category, situational. This can be anything that causes overwhelm in our nervous system. This can be anything that causes agitation or stress for us. Another example of situational is just being in big crowds, going to recovery meetings that are co-ed. That could be something that is triggering for you. So there can be situational threats. Another category of threats is intellectual. This is anything that involves either curiosity or investigation. For example, you think about this actress that you used to objectify and you haven't seen them in a movie in a while and you're wondering, well, I wonder what they're up to. I wonder if they have any new movies out, and you begin to investigate because it's only out of curiosity. That's a threat. Or perhaps it's looking up old friends from high school and finding them on social media and wondering what they're doing today, or especially looking up old flames and old girlfriends and seeing what they're up to today. Who are they married? What does he look like? Am I better looking than him? Does he have kids? What does she look like? All of these are intellectual threats coming from curiosity and investigation. I know some guys that an intellectual threat for them would be they're just curious to test and see if the filter is working on their internet access? Or Kevinize, is it still working on my device? This is a threat. You need to be aware of it. This is an intellectual threat. Another category is financial threats. This is a threat that has anything to do with finances whatsoever. It can be that you've got more money than you know what to do with, or it could be that you don't have enough money and you're in dire straits. It could be that the stock market just took a plunge and you took a huge loss and you're feeling all sorts of emotions from that. It could be an inheritance or some kind of windfall, some kind of unexpected money that you just received, and that can be a threat for you. Or it can be a major loss, like a natural disaster damaged your home and there's a significant insurance premium that you've got to pay and a significant loss. All of those could be tied to financial threats. Another threat is spiritual. This is keeping a check on what is your perception of God as you understand him. Do you see him as close, as intimate, as for you, not against you, as personal, as relatable, as a forgiving God, a benevolent God, a kind God, a powerful God, a God that's willing, ready, and able to help? Or are you seeing him as distant? Are you seeing him as judgmental? Are you seeing him as not in existence? Or perhaps you're not practicing your spiritual disciplines like you used to, whether it was recovery literature or Bible reading or listening to good teaching. Those are spiritual threats to be aware of and to keep your pulse on. Another category of threat is geographical. This could be certain parts of town that are just reminders to you and they are a threat to you. I know one brother that he had a job offer in an area that was close to the airport, and the airport area was where he used to act out, and he didn't feel like it was wise for him to take that job. That was a geographical threat for him. Another category of threat is chronological. There are certain times of the day or times of the year or seasons that can be a level of threat for us. For some, if you're staying up late, later than your partner, that can be a threat. That's a chronological threat. Or perhaps you work really hard and you make it till Friday and you feel like you deserve to reward yourself because that's what you used to do. Or you dreaded Mondays. You hated Mondays. You hated going back to work. So you would escape on Mondays and you would act out. Holidays are a time of year that for lots of men, those are threats for them. Those are times when they used to be so stressed out about being around extended family that they would feel the need to escape. So a chronological threat is something to be aware of. Then there's technological threats. Are you on a device that has unfiltered access? Are you watching TV and there's no filtering service? Do you have some kind of access to technology where there is the opportunity? Another category is emotional threats, and these are a big one. This is any emotion that we feel like we want to either escape or we want to medicate. These can be big triggers for us. In the category of emotional would be shame and what I call the 3 I's of shame. That is insignificance, incompetence, and impotence. Feeling like I'm not lovable and not valuable, that's insignificance. Incompetence, feeling like I can't do anything right or I'll never do enough for her. That's incompetence. Or impotence, feeling like I have no agency, I have no power, I have no vote, I have no say. My life is happening to me, I'm not happening to my life. That's impotence. When shame creeps in, we take on this Eeyore type mentality and we feel like we have no agency, no locus of control. And we feel like life is happening to us and we're just pathetic and sad and it's hopeless, there's nothing I can do. What we want to do when one of the 3 I's shows up for us is we want to take it to our higher power and we want to translate it through his help to the 3 R's. So we want to take the 3 I's and translate them to the 3 R's. The 3 R's are repentance, regret, and remorse. Repentance meaning we renew our mind, we change the way we think. We recognize that shame does not come from our higher power and it's based on a false belief. And so we let it go and we replace it with truth. Regret is keeping in mind, what did it cost us? What did our behavior cost us? And we regret that it may have cost us our retirement. It may have cost us our job. It may have cost us our reputation. It may have cost us so much time, so much money. What did it cost us? And the remorse is, what did it cost others? I have remorse that I caused so much pain. I have remorse that I did so much damage. I have remorse that my partner has trauma symptoms as a result of what I've done. So we take our 3 I's, we go to our higher power, and he helps translate them to the 3 R's: repentance, regret, and remorse. Another dynamic that falls under emotional threat is resentment. For many of us, resentments were a big part of our acting out behavior. And if we're still holding on to resentments, we're at a risk for returning to our acting out behavior. So the antidote for resentment is either gratitude and or forgiveness, offering grace to the person who we feel like has offended us and wronged us in some way. Another big emotional trigger for many of us is any sense or feeling of rejection. And if we feel that, we need to acknowledge that. We need to recognize that as a threat, as a risk, and do something with that rejection. Namely, what's behind that feeling of rejection is the need for acceptance, the need for being seen, being validated, being heard, or being celebrated, being acknowledged. And you can go to God, self, and others to get that legitimate need met in a legitimate way. Just recognize that that's a threat. When you're feeling resentment, when you're feeling rejection, those are threats that you need to act on so they don't become triggers for acting out. Another category of threats is physical. And this would involve anything with our five senses. Not only anything we see, which is getting into lust and objectification, but this can also relate to certain scents that we smell, certain tastes that remind us of acting out, whether it's a drink or food, certain songs that we hear with our ears. Any of our five senses can be a threat to us that we need to be aware of. And finally, relational threats. Perhaps we find ourselves wanting to impress a specific coworker, and so we dress to impress them, or we say things in meeting to impress them, and we secretly look forward to seeing them in the office the next day. That is a relational threat that we need to be aware of. Perhaps you've had conflict with your partner, and you're feeling distant, and you're feeling some resentment. That is a relational threat. Perhaps you have a conversation that you know is coming up with a certain family member that is really disappointing and a source of stress for you because you want to have a connection with them, and it's become clear that that's never going to happen. Or they're a very unhealthy person. They're a very judgmental person. It's someone that causes you a lot of overwhelm and a lot of dysregulation, and you're anticipating having a conversation with them, or you just had a conversation with them. That can be a relational threat for you. So the outer circle of the threat detection tool is looking at 12 different categories of threats that we need to be mindful of. So if you just had a relapse, I encourage you to look at the acting and behaviors, those 12 behaviors, and the 12 categories of threats to see what were the influences, what were the contributions, what were the threats that I didn't take seriously that helped lead me to think that acting out was a good idea. None of these are causes. These are contributors. None of these are excuses, but they help explain. There is no excuse and there is no cause. Bottom line is we chose to do this. We acted out because we chose to do this. The question is, why did we choose this? So that we can strengthen our threat detection plan or our relapse prevention plan to make sure this never happens again. So that is the tool that you can use to do a relapse map or a relapse review to reflect, how did this happen? And how do I make sure that this never happens again? Now I want to talk to you about a process you can follow if you've had a relapse. You immediately need to step into these three processes. And these are in no particular order. These need to be happening simultaneously. They need to be pursued immediately as part of your relapse recovery plan. But I like to think of these as a three-legged stool where you need all three. If one of these are missing, your recovery is not going to stand. It's going to fall. And so the first stool in the three-legged stool, the first process to follow is absolute radical honesty. Radical honesty. Sharing those things that you thought you would never share with anyone else. And for most of us, what that's going to include is a disclosure process. A disclosure process is where we work to share our entire story, good, bad, and ugly, with our partner so that they know the truth and they can make a decision about their future. Here's what I want to suggest. For most of us, if there's been a relapse, the reason our partner knows about it is because they discovered it. Now, I know a few brothers, the reason their partner knows about their activity is because they disclosed it. But for most of us, we were discovered. And that's the common way that our partners find out. If you were discovered, what I want to suggest to you is that the reason you were discovered is not because your partner discovered you. It's because God exposed you. I believe that God is involved in every discovery. I also believe is involved in every disclosure. So whether you're acting out with something you disclosed or it's something your partner discovered, God's involved in that. Scriptures say from the teachings of Jesus, what we do in the darkness will be shouted from the rooftops. That is, we will be exposed. And anytime we are exposed, that is God's invitation to step into intimacy with him in particular. That is his invitation to confess, to come clean, to admit what we've done, to be radically honest. Our exposure from God is a gift from God. Our full confession to him and to others is our gift back to God. So I don't want you to see your discovery or your disclosure as something that had nothing to do with God. It was just your partner found out, she saw your history on the internet, or she caught you in the act, or she found a receipt or whatever. That is all what's happening in the physical realm. What's happening in the spiritual realm is God orchestrated your exposure. Your D-Day is because God planned it. He exposed you. And this was a gift from him because this is no way to live. He wants you to stop. He doesn't want you hurting his daughter. He doesn't want you living with sexual integrity issues. He wants you to live an integrous life, a whole life, a healthy life, an intimate life with him, with yourself, and with others. That's what he desires. And so his exposure of you was his timing, his plan, his way of inviting you into intimacy with him. This is going to be very hard to be radically honest. If you're like me, it's something that you've never done before in your life. We lie today for 3 reasons. And we learned this in our childhood, and it was solidified as we grew up. And it was perfected in our adulthood. But we lie for 3 reasons. It's either damage control, image management, or it's simply a habit. And any of those can be undone. Damage control, we think that we're limiting the damage to our partner by lying, but actually we cause more damage when we lie and those lies are exposed. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're lying to try and avoid damage, we end up causing more damage. Or we lie because of image management, or we lie because it's simply a habit. The very first thing we need to step into, the very first process or way of living that we've got to embrace immediately after a relapse is probably for the first time in your life, you've got to embrace radical honesty. God exposed you because he wants you to bring it into the light. Take the risk of doing that. Confess everything you've done to God, to yourself, and to one other person. Usually that does need to include your partner. They have veto power. They may not want to know everything, but they get to decide that. You don't get to decide that. You practice radical honesty. The second process is intimacy with God, self, and others, in that order. So we need to take a look at what we've done, and we need to understand, why did we do this? We didn't act out because there was an opportunity. We didn't act out because we had the chance. There were some things internally going on inside of us that God could show us in our intimate connection with him. He could shine a spotlight into our motives, into our woundings, into our pain, into our thoughts, into our self-deceptions, and he can show us the why. Why did we do this? It's in intimacy with God, self, and others. That is the true antidote for acting out behavior. Like we said earlier, the opposite of addiction is intimacy. And intimacy needs to go in that order: God, self, others. That is the exact order that the 12 steps go in. The first few steps are about intimacy with God, steps 1 through 3. Steps 4, 5, 6, and 7 is about intimacy with self. Step 8 and 9 is about intimacy with others. And then step 10 through 12 is maintaining the intimacy with God, self, and others. So it's in that order by design, and I think it's a brilliant design. But we need to step in not only radical honesty and coming clean with what we've done, but practicing intimacy with God, self, and others. Men, by and large, are terrified of intimacy. Absolutely terrified. Now, I know according to the man box, according to the collective socialization of what it means to be a man, we're not supposed to have any fears, and we certainly don't admit them. But most of us are absolutely terrified to take the risk of removing the fig leaf and showing others who we really are, the good, bad, and ugly. And this is a legitimate fear of ours, and we've got to overcome it. I have so many clients that they tell me over and over again, I am so scared to share my resentments with my partner, to share my failures with my partner, to share my acting out behaviors with my partner, to share my fears with my partner, to share what I'm really thinking, what I'm really feeling. It's so terrifying. It's so much easier to act in, to just avoid intimacy, to keep the covering, to keep hiding, to keep the figurative fig leaves in place so that they don't see who I really am. Intimacy literally means into me see. What your partner wants more than anything else is emotional intimacy with you, that you would let them in, because they've realized they don't know who you are. They really don't know you, but they want to know you. And when we let them in, we can let them know us. It reminds me of a experience that I had back when I was a teenager. I mustered up the courage to go on a bungee jump. And so I climbed up this huge structure all the way up to the very top. And there was a volunteer up there, one of the workers, that would tie you to this bungee cord, and they would secure you in this harness. And then you were supposed to jump. So that was the whole premise. And I'm terrified the whole way of climbing all the way up there. And then the worker is putting on the harness and securing the bungee to me. And I noticed that the worker had a t-shirt that they were wearing. And this is what the t-shirt said: shut up and jump. And I imagine that that worker has heard every excuse under the sun, has had so many people that even though they were prepared and they weren't going to be harmed and all the safety testing was done and no one had died at this event, they still were terrified and they had all these excuses and all these questions. And I imagine this volunteer had heard it all. And so he just got a t-shirt to be somewhat proactive and just shut up and jump. You're going to be fine. You're going to be okay. You're safe. It's going to be fun. It's going to be worth it. Yes, it's risky, but others have done it. You can do it. You will survive this. You'll be glad you did it. Shut up and jump. And sometimes with my brothers in recovery, I want to wear that t-shirt and just say, shut up and jump. I know you're scared. I know it's risky, but intimacy is worth it. You'll be glad you did it. You're not going to die from this. It's going to all be worth it. Just shut up and jump. Just let go of the excuses. Just let go of the fear. You've made it this far. You're ready. Just shut up and jump. Just lean in. Just allow her to see who you really are. So that's the second leg of the stool. You got radical honesty. You need to immediately start practicing radical honesty right after a relapse. You need to pursue intimacy with God, self, and others. And one great way to do that is to go through the steps, the 12 steps. But the third leg on the stool is accountability. You need to enter into accountability. Now, I need to clarify what I mean by accountability because there's a lot of misunderstanding around accountability. There's 3 myths in particular when it comes to accountability. The first myth is this: no one holds you accountable. That's not what accountability is. No one holds you accountable. You hold yourself accountable. You're just inviting others to the process. Let's say I'm your accountability partner. I can't make you do anything. I can't stop you from doing anything. If you're going to act out, I can't prevent it. I can't stop it. What I can be is invited into your process of being intimate with you, of you being intimate with me and sharing what you're experiencing, what you're feeling, and what's really going on inside of you. And I can be the person you call when you hold yourself accountable, who will understand, who will support you, not judge you, not throw you under the bus or shame you, but will be there for you. That's an accountability partner. But the accountability process is not your accountability partner making sure you do or don't do something. You hold yourself accountable. So when these brothers use the excuse, well, I've got no accountability partner, and so I acted out. Or when they're partners, they're coming from a good place. They're coming from a place of pain, but they say, my husband or my partner keeps acting out and no one will hold him accountable. They can't hold him accountable. That's a myth. They need to hold themselves accountable, but they need an accountability partner, or ideally a list of 5 men that they can call so that they can hold themselves accountable. So the first myth is someone else holds me accountable. That's not true. You hold yourself accountable. The second misunderstanding is that anyone can be an accountability partner just as long as they're in recovery, and that's not true. You want someone who is spiritually fit. You want someone who has some success, who has healthy recovery. There are some men you don't want to speak into your life. You don't want them to be an accountability partner. They're not doing the work. They don't have a good relationship with their partner. They're not in real recovery. They don't need to be speaking into your life and helping to hold you accountable. So that's a myth. Anyone can be my accountability partner? No. It needs to be someone who is in true recovery and they're spiritually fit. And then third, when it comes to accountability, is not only do you hold yourself accountable, and not only do you need to have someone who is spiritually fit, but retro accountability doesn't work. And that's what most accountability looks like. Most accountability is we talk to each other once a week and I tell you all the ways that I failed this week. That's not accountability. That doesn't affect change whatsoever. Accountability is making the phone call before you take action. Retro doesn't work. Real time works. You call your accountability partner when you're on the precipice of a decision. When you see one of these 12 areas of threat happening. When you realize that I'm acting in and I'm setting myself up for acting out. That's when you call an accountability partner. So the 3 processes that you need to engage in as soon as there's been a relapse is radical honesty. You come clean, you go through a disclosure process. You recognize that God's the one that has exposed you because he wants intimacy with you. Second process is intimacy with God, self, and others. Intimacy that we've never practiced before, so that we have recovery that we've never had before. And then third, true accountability, which is holding yourself accountable, but you have someone to call. The person you call is a healthy brother who's doing true recovery and is spiritually fit, and realize that retro doesn't work, that the way you practice accountability needs to be in real time. You recognize a threat that's in your threat detection tool, and you reach out to someone. So I hope this has been a helpful episode as we talked about 1 tool, 3 processes, and let me end with one more tool, and that is a free tool that we have on our website called Is the Recovery Real? And these are 9 vital diagnostic questions that Jacqueline and I have come up with for you to take an audit of your recovery and see, am I doing recovery or am I being in recovery? Am I checking the box or am I in authentic recovery? And if you'll click on that link in the show notes, you can get that free tool. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.